Good afternoon on today's Angry Bulletin. Excitement in the spaceflight community is building to a fever pitch as SpaceX prepares for the fourth orbital flight test of Starship. However, an elephant in the room not being discussed could put the future of at least Artemis 3 in significant jeopardy. The orbital launch mount, although sustaining far less damage than the first orbital test, still has not been completely repaired, even after more than 2 weeks of work. If this pattern continues, how is it going to impact Starship's launch cadence and its ability to refuel in low Earth orbit? And how will that impact Artemis 3? All of this and more coming at you on the Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to another Angry Bulletin here on the Angry Astronaut. I'm going to go ahead and throw out a disclaimer immediately to save myself from at least a little bit of grief, although I am unquestionably going to be accused of SpaceX bashing regardless of what I have to say here, but still, I'm going to give it my best shot. My viewpoints about Starship may seem quite harsh, and I understand why some people would feel that way. My viewpoints about Starship would not be nearly so harsh if SpaceX did not have a contract with NASA to put human beings back on the moon by third quarter of 2026, an aspirational date that I think all of us know is completely unattainable. That being the case, though, when can we realistically expect SpaceX to put human beings back on the moon, that Starship will be able to carry all of this out? Well, this is a question that's subject to a lot of unknown factors when it comes to low Earth orbit refueling, fuel depots, how many refueling missions are going to be required. All of these things are probably going to be pretty complex hurdles to overcome before we can even look at putting an unmanned Starship on the lunar surface, let alone a Starship with astronauts on board. But there's another factor that nobody is really talking about, and this comes as a bit of a shock to me, that may throw the entire project into serious jeopardy. And that is the matter of how powerful Starship is. Starship's exhaust and Starship's thrust is so overwhelmingly powerful that even though the damage to the orbital launch mount is not nearly as bad as the first launch attempt, even though it appears that the OLM has escaped largely unscathed, that is not really the case. In the aftermath of Flight 2 and the aftermath of Flight 3, we have had SpaceX workers swarming the OLM in a frenzy, trying to repair damage as rapidly as possible. And as of yesterday, they were continuing these repair operations. And keep in mind, that's 17 days after launch. And consequently, S-29 had to carry out its static fire on a different pad, and we haven't had a static fire from the booster at all at this point, let alone any sort of wet dress rehearsal with the full stack. If damage to the OLM is significant enough to cause delays between missions of a month or even more, that puts the entire future of Artemis 3 in significant jeopardy. Now, before I go any further, I would like to express my deepest appreciation to my friends at Lab Padre, to RGV Aerial Photography, and to NASA Spaceflight, especially to Boca Chica Gal, the only Boca Chica native who has been covering Starship development since the beginning. Thank you so much for all of your incredible footage and your incredible coverage. Now, to be fair, NASA Spaceflight did make a brief mention of OLM damage in their most recent news report. Quote, "The OLM will require some repairs and work. Teams took apart the booster quick disconnect hood, or the BQD, to reveal significant damage to the main liquid oxygen and liquid methane cryogenic hoses that supply the booster. These must be repaired or replaced before any testing can occur on the OLM." And it also appears that the chopsticks sustained some damage at least, were twisted a bit out of shape in the immediate aftermath of the launch, and also some of the tanks and the surrounding launch facility sustained some damage. Once again, none of this is incredibly significant, but given how extensively the OLM has been beefed up against damage, including extensive shielding and other precautions made to try to minimize damage taken from Starship, it's kind of difficult to imagine what more they can do to keep the OLM from sustaining at least some damage after every launch. And if this leads to a delay of a month or so between launches, that kind of launch cadence could be absolutely cataclysmic to the future of Artemis. Let me try to explain why. Now, one thing that kind of concerns me is the latest diagram of the Artemis 3 mission really doesn't include a great deal of detail about what SpaceX actually has to do to fulfill their part of the mission. They have step 1, the launch of SLS and Orion, and then you have to jettison the rocket boosters, obviously, the fairings and the launch abort system, then the core stage, main engine cutoff, all of this very typical. The vehicle enters Earth orbit and performs a perigee raise maneuver. Then there's systems checks, solar panel adjustments, making sure that Orion doesn't have to return to Earth before making it to the moon, and then a trans-lunar injection burn after that. And the ICPS, of course, carries out the majority of that trans-lunar injection burn, and then Orion is on its way out to the moon. Again, no mention of Starship yet, but Starship will have had to have done a hell of a lot before any of this happens, but we'll get to that in just a moment. So when Orion reaches the moon, it will carry out a powered flyby of the moon approximately 100 kilometers or around 60 miles away from the moon. Then Orion will have to carry out an insertion burn to put it into its rectilinear halo orbit, that same orbit that the Lunar Gateway will occupy in the future. And then after that, lunar landing preparation. That's a very vague step, but that's the next step in the process according to NASA. It doesn't describe the docking process or everything Starship needs to do to become hooked on to the Orion in lunar orbit. But again, we'll get to that in a moment. The lander then undocks and separates. Lander enters low lunar orbit. Then there's lunar surface exploration for about a week. 2 astronauts, one of whom will be a woman, one of whom will be a person of color. They will explore the moon for a much longer period of time than Apollo astronauts ever did in the past. Then, after that, the HLS ascends to low lunar orbit. The lander performs a rendezvous and docking with Orion. Then the crew returns in Orion after the Orion undocks and performs an orbital departure burn. There's one more return-powered flyby of the moon, again approximately 100 kilometers away from the moon. And then you have the final return trajectory correction burn, which puts Orion on course for a re-entry. Then, of course, there's the re-entry, the splashdown, and the mission is completed. So what all does Starship need to do to carry out their part of the mission? Well, I think all of us know that it's going to be far more complicated and involve a lot more logistics than the SLS part of the mission. Granted, I think this is the best way, in the long run anyway, for us to carry out manned exploration of the solar system, but it is admittedly a lot more complicated. So let's get right down to it. First of all, you have to put an orbital fuel depot, presumably a modified Starship, that will carry enough propellant to completely refuel lunar Starship. Once that fuel depot is in place, 10 refueling launches will need to be sent up to that fuel depot in order to make sure it has enough methane and enough oxidizer in order to completely refuel lunar Starship. Once that is carried out, lunar Starship docks with the fuel depot and is completely refueled. Then, lunar Starship has to make its way to the same rectilinear halo orbit that Orion is going to occupy so it can successfully dock with the Orion capsule. The astronauts can transfer into lunar Starship and it can make its descent. So what we're looking at here is a minimum of 11 or 12 Starship launches in order to put 2 astronauts on the surface of the moon. I've said this a couple of times before, but herein lies a problem. If, in the aftermath of a launch, it takes SpaceX a month to repair the orbital launch mount and the associated launch facility sufficiently to accommodate another static fire, another wet dress rehearsal, another stacking, everything that is necessary to get Starship off the ground again, that means that we're looking at nearly a year from the first refueling launch to the moment that Starship docks with the fuel depot in orbit in order to take on the necessary methalox to get all the way to the moon, pick up the astronauts in orbit, and then take them down to the lunar surface, and then return them safely to Orion or to the Lunar Gateway. Why is this a problem? It's something called propellant boil-off. Anything left out in space, any liquid left out in space, even in an insulated fuel tank, is going to start boiling off the propellant that's inside those tanks every time it gets exposed to the intense heat of the sun. How much propellant is lost? Well, if you have no mitigation system to control boil-off, and I'll explain what that means, you're looking at losing 1% of the fuel in your tanks every 3 days. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that you lose 100% over the course of a year, because you're losing 1% of whatever fuel remains every time you lose 1% every 3 days. You're never really going to completely run out, but nevertheless, you're looking at losing at least 50% of the propellant and oxidizer available to Starship in a year's time, which means you would need another 5 refueling launches to make up for that problem. And then those 5 refueling launches in turn would take another 5 months, and you lose another 20% or something along those lines to boil off, which means you need to make another couple of launches. And this may be why NASA estimates that it's going to take 16, 17, maybe 18 refueling launches in order to get Starship to the moon, which in my opinion is starting to border on the ridiculous. Now, if you use a launch pad in Boca Chica and another launch pad in Cape Canaveral, in my opinion, the second pad that they're making use of in Boca Chica is going to be a capture tower. By the way, that's an entirely separate animal. What happens if you have an unsuccessful capture when the booster is returning and an explosion that damages the launch facility? It's even more delays, but let's not get into that right now. Let's say you can double the speed of that cadence and launch twice a month. Well, that means that you're looking at 5 to 6 months before you can completely refuel Starship, and in that time, you're still losing about 25 to 30% of your propellant and oxidizer, which once again requires more refueling launches, which in turn loses more propellant. You see where I'm coming from here. And this assumes that everything goes close to perfectly during this entire refueling process, which is highly unlikely. So what do we do about all of this? Well, I got the details that I've just shared with you about propellant boil-off rate from a ULA document on the matter. By the way, not talking about liquid hydrogen boil-off here, I'm talking about liquid oxygen, and that represents 2/3 of what Starship carries is liquid oxygen. Only about 1/3 of it is methane. That being the case, though, what do? Well, ULA came up with a great idea for a Centaur-based fuel depot quite some time ago, before a certain Alabama senator recognized that low Earth orbit refueling put his favorite SLS project in jeopardy, and he used his political influence to force ULA to give up the project. They are, however, beginning to embark on getting into this again, but that's a different story. As you can see here, this is a little different than just a fuel tank in space. It's comprised of a sun shield. That is one of the most important components of a fuel depot, is something to keep the sun off the fuel tanks, and also solar panels to power an active cooling system. You don't need a tremendous amount of energy, but still enough to keep all all of that propellant and oxidizer cool. If you have a system like this, you can reduce propellant boil off to as little as 0.08% per day, which is approximately 1% every couple of weeks. That is a much better equation. One that even a year's refueling wouldn't have quite as much of an impact on. You'd lose maybe 10% of your propellant in a year, maybe 5% in 6 months. Now, the aspirational objective is to get propellant boil off down to 0%, something that Jeff Bezos talks a great deal about, but still, that is a goal, something that we haven't achieved except in a laboratory setting, and something that would be very difficult to achieve in orbit, especially with a very large amount of propellant and oxidizer. So what's the problem? Let's just go ahead and build one of these types of fuel depots. Well, here's the issue. The sun shield, the active cooling system, all of this stuff is pretty heavy. Not only that, it's sort of complicated from a technological perspective. It's very difficult to imagine that SpaceX is going to be able to come up with this kind of sophisticated fuel depot between now and third quarter of 2026. Indeed, I think it will be very difficult for them to come up with a Starship that resembles this fuel depot any earlier than 2028, and it could be as late as 2030. And that's when Artemis gets into a real serious bind. If we're looking at an 8-year time frame passing between Artemis 1 and Artemis 3, it is very likely that Congress is going to run out of patience with this multi-billion-dollar project that is yet to produce any kind of real results and shut the whole damn thing down, which of course is the last thing any of us wants, regardless of whether we hate Elon Musk, hate Starship, hate SLS. None of us wants to see Artemis get shut down. Now, once again, to be clear, I am 100% confident that SpaceX is eventually going to be able to overcome all of these problems. They'll be able to jump through all of these hoops and get astronauts to the surface of the moon. The problem is, when is it going to happen, and will it happen soon enough? That is very problematic in my opinion, and something that NASA really needs to be seriously looking at. And the best solution, in my opinion, is to call off the whole idea of trying to put humans on the moon with Artemis 3. Artemis 3 needs to be about the lunar gateway, about putting humans in orbit around the moon on a permanent space station and keeping them there for several weeks, carrying out a variety of different experiments to simulate the effects of interplanetary travel on astronauts. This would be a very worthwhile mission for NASA, and one that would really excite the American public to put astronauts on a permanent space station, the first one ever to orbit the Earth, and have them stay there for a lengthy period of time, giving us daily updates on what they're seeing on the moon, the experiments they're carrying out, that sort of thing. That would be a very exciting Artemis 3 mission that wouldn't require Starship to reach a level of development that it simply cannot reach by third quarter of 2026, and very probably not by 2028 either. We'll see if that actually happens. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. I would also like to thank the incredible digital artist Nick Henning, who not only allows me to use his amazing lunar Starship footage, but on top of that, he also has created a number of exclusive designs for my merch. And I tell you something, awesome stuff that feature both SLS and Starship. And we have a race going on between Starship and SLS. Starship holds a narrow lead. We're talking a mere 3-shirt lead between SLS and Starship at the moment. So if you want to add to Starship's lead, all the details are in the description, and I have the merch tagged in this video as well. Or if you'd like to help the big orange rocket catch up, well, you know what to do, and you get a 10% discount between now and the end of April if you use the code MUA10. Oh yeah, and one other bonus. Whichever team wins, one one random winner will get a one-of-a-kind piece of merch, also from Nick Henning, and this one features the dark horse of the rocket competition, and that is Rocket Lab Neutron. One-of-a-kind piece of merchandise, one winner only, and then the winning team will also get a video made about their favorite rocket and some unique applications that you may not have thought of for either Starship or SLS, depending on who wins. Once again, thank you for watching. Please like, please subscribe, and as always, stay angry about space.